You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
So what we're doing during this time in the service is we're going through the book of James. James is a book near the very end of the Bible. And if you've been here, you know what we've seen and what we've said is that what James is about and what it's trying to communicate to us is living faith, which is why the sermon series is titled that. And as you go through, you see like what's the genuine article of Christian living look like? What's this like? What's it supposed to be? And how do you know if it's authentic? And so he's gone through, and we've seen that this living faith looks like a kind of unique endurance in times of suffering, difficult times that affect you but don't overthrow you. There's no partiality to authentic Christian living. There's no discrimination. There's a kind of caring for those in need, even when it's difficult. There's a way that you bring gentleness and grace and harmony to the things you touch, to the places you go. And what's interesting about all that is you start putting it all together, and you see how difficult this can be. And you find that James, in writing all this stuff, is dealing with people who aren't very good at it. Like, judging by the way he's writing the book, there are plenty of people in the churches he's writing to that are full of, selfish ambition and vain conceit and fighting and quarreling. And so he doesn't write, I'm so glad none of you are dealing with this, but in case you bump into someone who does, here's what you can tell them. He's writing to them because they are dealing with all this stuff. They need to be corrected on this, to be encouraged, to live the genuine Christian life, which makes it very helpful for us. Because given that this is not for one small rogue group in the churches he's writing to, that means that then and now, most people need to hear this stuff. Most people will experience these things. And so, as you preach through a book like this, you find yourself challenged and convicted and confronted that, such that we realize very quickly, this is not just something we can tell those other people, something we have to do ourselves. And so then the question comes up, so what do you do when that is your situation? When you see yourself, loosely, in what he's saying, when you find yourself struggling to move forward, when you don't want to admit that these things are true, in yourself, but yet you find that they kind of are. What do you do when you realize you aren't living the genuine Christian life yourself? And that's what James tells us in the passage we have for this morning. It's the center of the letter in almost every way. It's where all the different threads come together. It's both the deepest and the strongest thing that he'll tell us. And it's the thing that without it, you'll never fully understand the rest of the book. And so without today, in other words, you might know what James wants you to be like, but you will not actually be what James wants you to be like. You'll know how important it is to be impartial and non-discriminatory in the way you give love to others and the way you treat other people. You'll understand the dynamics of it. You'll understand the significance of it. You'll be able to explain it to other people. You can become a kind of expert in it, but it won't actually be in you. It won't be the kind of thing that you find happening in your own life in all different situations. And that's also not just for people sort of in the church who are concerned with this. This is a concern outside the church in our larger culture and our larger society as well. Everyone wants to know these days, what does it look like to be someone who's genuinely loving? Genuinely impartial and non-discriminatory? To genuinely treat people equally? What does it look like in a place that seems really fractured and really divided in intractable and kind of hopeless ways? What does it look like to actually bring peace and harmony? What does it mean to be gentle? How do you do this sort of a thing? We're very interested in being that kind of person, and we are also very interested in getting our own way. And so we're in this situation as a society where we want to change, but we don't want to change. We want to grow, but we don't want to grow. And we're in this situation as Christians. We want to change, but we don't want to change. We want to grow, but we don't want to grow. How do you make this real? What do we do? Well, James tells us, and we'll read it. So we're going to read James 4. We'll use the passage Scott preached last week as kind of a runway to jump into our passage for this week. We'll read James 4, verse 1 through 10. It's on page 1012 to 1013 of the Red Pew Bibles in front of you. It'll also be on the screen behind me. Here's what James says. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive, because you ask wrongly, to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the Scripture says, He yearns jealously over the Spirit that He has made to dwell in us, but He gives more grace? Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will exalt you. This is the word of the Lord. So what does James say? What do you do? What do you need to know? What do you need to learn when you're the one who's not living the genuine Christian life? He says you need to know three things: the depth of God's love, the depth of our rejection, and the way grace changes us. The depth of God's love first, then the depth of our rejection, and then the way grace changes us. So first, the depth of God's love. Now, he opens our passage, you adulterous people. Now, one of the interesting things about seeing something go wrong is that it teaches you about what it's supposed to look like when it goes right. So when someone looks at you and says, the problem with this knife is that it's dull, you learn that knives are supposed to be sharp. And in the same way here, when James is showing you what's going wrong, he's also showing you what it means for something to go right. And what we have here is James showing us what our relationship with God is supposed to be. What is God's love supposed to induce in us? What's that relationship dynamic supposed to be like? And it's a deep kind of love he's talking about. The literal translation for verse 4 is not you adulterous people, it's you adulteresses. And so you have to ask, why talk to men and women using just the female language? What James is doing is he's connecting back to one of the great themes of the Bible, that the depth of God's love for his people is not just that of a shepherd for his sheep. It's not just that of a father for his children. It's that of a husband for his wife. There's a marital love. There's a spousal kind of love that's one of the great themes of the entire Bible, especially in the Old Testament. And when the Bible says things like that, for example, Isaiah 54:5, your maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name. The Holy One of Israel, your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth, he is called. When the Bible does that, it's not meant for us to read it and say, cool, okay, and then move on. There's an invitation to dwell. There's an invitation to meditate. What does it mean for God to say, this is the depth, this is the dynamic of relationship I want to have with you in love? And so you're invited then to look at what what the best kind of marriage is supposed to be like. You're invited to look at how the tenor of these things are supposed to go when they're at their absolute perfect, their best, the most perfect, most perfection involved. And then you look at that, and what you begin to find is all sorts of things. And so there's a sense in which what we're being invited to do is kind of a communal meditation on this. And so you do it together, and you say, okay, what is the kind of depth of love a husband ought to have for a wife? What is a spousal kind of love supposed to be? And you come up with all sorts of things relatively quickly if you dwell. For example, one is that kind of love has a singularity of focus. There's a kind of uniqueness to a spousal love that's not true of other relationships. A shepherd can have lots of sheep, and a father can have lots of children, but a husband has only one wife. There's a singularity there of focus. There's a sense that, in the Bible, we'll talk about, the church as a whole, us together as the bride of Christ, the people of God together. But that doesn't, therefore, mean that sort of every person gets whatever percentage is allotted, divide God's love into 1,001,200. That's not how it works. He also says he knows the hairs on your head. They're all numbered. Easier for me than for some. Nevertheless, it communicates a kind of take a second. It communicates a kind of a depth of focus on the individual as well. There's a singularity of focus here. He gives us then a full focus. There's a way of that relationship existing that we need to notice. For example, one of the weird things about healthy marriages is that they do this thing where at the end of the day, they look at each other after being apart, usually, for a decent chunk of the day, and they say, how was your day? Often knowing full well what their day entailed. My wife and I share a calendar. She knows exactly where I was all day. And yet still she wants, how was your day? Oh, well, I did this and this and this. And so it's fascinating. One of the signs of a very unhealthy marriage, a marriage that's breaking down, is that no one is interested in those details anymore. There's a kind of focus with a spousal love on that individual focus on what happened that day, the granularity of detail. You care about the small things. You notice, pay attention, invite that discussion. You don't only talk about the most important things. There's that singularity of focus. There's a uniqueness, an interest that gets into the details. That's part of what spousal love looks like. But you keep dwelling and you get more. There's also a singularity, a singular kind of communion or intimacy or closeness that comes here. There's a kind of relationship between spouses that is not shared with children or with close friends or any of these sorts of things. The idea is that the relationship between husband and wife is just simply different in terms of connection. There's a way in which husbands and wives tend to travel through things together in a unique way. You can also do that with friends, but there's a way that all of a sudden, once you're married, you're sort of yoked to this person, and everything you go through, they go through too. And everything they go through, you go through. There's a way that not just a sharing of details happens in a good marriage, but a sharing of the deep things, a sharing of the experiences, a sharing of the fears and the hopes and the dreams and the desires. There's a unique kind of intimacy to this, a unique kind of communion. And then, these are, if there was a Venn diagram with these things, there'd be a lot of purple. But there's also a singular kind of commitment. One of the central ideas of marriage is the primacy of that relationship and loyalty to that relationship in a way that eclipses the others. That's why all the way back in Genesis 2, you have at the end of this creation story with the first man and the first woman, and they get married, and all of a sudden this interjection happens, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. The primacy of that family relationship, of parent and child, is all of a sudden eclipsed by a new primacy, a new kind of loyalty between husband and wife. It becomes the primary relationship out of which you live. And so, now there's more we could say, but you put all this together and you hear Isaiah 54:5. Your maker is your husband. You hear James talk about the kind of relationship God wants to have with us. And you see what that means is he has a singular focus on you, a singular connection with you, a singular kind of commitment to you. This is the depth of his love. Such that later on you find out he's jealous for you. That's in verse 5. He yearns jealously over the spirit he's made to dwell in us. Now, if you have a different translation, you might notice this can be translated a couple of ways. It's pretty rare in the Bible, but it happens like every once in a while, where you can see it kind of go both ways in translation into the English or in a different language. One translation makes this out to be sort of our spirit envies a lot, sort of selfishly jealous about a lot of things, kind of like James said a few paragraphs ago. The other translation, the one that we have in the ESV Bible here, talks about God's righteous jealousy, like for us. So when we wander away, he's jealous for us. Both are true across the Bible. On balance, it seems like the ESV one is the right one, the one that we read just now, because of verses in the Old Testament that James relies on a lot, like Exodus 34, verse 14, where God's talking to his people and he says, "You shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God." Now, our experience with jealousy tends to be a kind of selfish jealousy, where it's not the other person's best interest isn't at heart. It's sort of like, I'm jealous for you because even though you might flourish somewhere else, I want you with me, so I'm going to sort of make your life difficult unless you are with me, that kind of jealousy. That's not the kind of jealousy God is talking about here. This is a righteous sort of jealousy that comes out of the depth of love God has for you. Because we all know, when you watch someone you love hurt themselves, it's incredibly trying. Like some of you are experiencing, maybe right now, someone you love and they're hurting themselves, and it's an emotive thing. It's a visceral kind of reaction. And watching a spouse hurt themselves by rejecting you is probably the worst version of that. And that's because of the singular focus, the singular connection, the singular commitment. Like it's the depth of love itself that produces this kind of righteous jealousy. It creates a jealousy that's not selfish, like I want, no matter what's good for you, I want you with me. It creates a righteous jealousy that's this sort of personalized claim over a person that says, You're mine so that you might be loved, so you might be safe and secure and stable and blessed and thrive. It's that kind of thing. And because there's that, I don't know who said it, that old saying, the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. God is not indifferent to you. If he was indifferent to you and you wandered away, he wouldn't be very jealous at all. But he is. He has a depth of love that requires him. It creates a condition in which he's jealous when you wander. Put it this way, you can't be this loved, this welcomed, this accepted, this cared for, this committed to, without also having this kind of jealousy present when you wander away to hurt yourself. The very focus and communion and commitment that creates an environment that has this kind of love creates also an environment where if you step out, these things are violated. And that's what you want. Like a husband that never gets jealous when you leave and hurt yourself is a husband that has no love for you. And a God that doesn't care what you do is a God that doesn't actually love you. A lot of people, we create this fictitious version of God that says, he loves me so much, he'll let me do whatever I want. That's not love. A parent that loves their kid so much that they let their kid do whatever they want just has an orphan. At some level, real love demands some kind of response, some kind of ownership, some kind of jealousy over what you do. If he doesn't love you this way, then he doesn't love you. He's just fond of you when he happens to think about you, which is not what the Bible says, and it's not what you want. And so what's the depth of God's love? It's the depth of a husband's love for a wife. He's interested in you. There's a primary relationship you have with him. There's a commitment level that you have with him. He desires to be close to you on that level. Now, what that means then is that this kind of love is going to demand a primacy in your life. You can't slice this a different way. There has to be then a sort of correlating primary focus and primary communion and connection and primary commitment from you for him. Like when you think of God's love in a different way as a kind of a grandparent love, which is wonderful, or a close friend love, which is wonderful, but not this, then you end up with a love that's just slightly more distant, slightly less involved, something you can step into and step out of. And I think we all know that treating a really good husband as though he were just a friend that you can step into and step out of isn't just problematic, it's offensive, it's reductive, it's condescending and selfish and unjust. And so when you have a God with a depth of love like this, the idea is he wants this kind of presence in your life. This kind of relationship is what you're created for. This is the kind of relationship he's due. And that requires like an attention paid to him throughout the day, a life lived in reference to him. I know one pastor who got married a little later in life. He's a bookish guy, and he went to work, like 2 weeks after he got married, went to work, and then decided to go by the bookstore for a couple hours, which he did all the time before he was married, and then came home 2 hours late. Didn't call his wife, didn't text his wife because didn't occur to him that she might think he was dead on a road somewhere or whatever. And he put it really funny. So he said, I came home, and she was not happy with me, and it was at that moment I realized I'd lost control of my life. Because that's what, at some level, that's what that singular commitment, all these singular things do, is they create a situation in which your decisions, your time, your schedule, frankly, your emotions, your personality, nothing is just yours anymore. It's ours now. Everything, you've lost control of your life. And it's the same thing here with this theme in the Bible. That's what this kind of love does. Love of this depth means you've lost control over your life. This kind of love can't be dealt with by keeping God at arm's length. What he's interested in is a kind of life where you are always living in reference to him. You're always living in reference to his love. Every moment, every day, the primary relationship and primary thought patterns you have regard him. That's the depth of love God has. Do you see that love in him? Do you see that love at work in your life? Or do you find yourself reducing and repackaging his love into what feels like a different format so you can get a little purchase on your own life, so you can step into and step out of to fit your desires and your desire to control your life a little more? This is the depth of God's love. Now, that leads you to the depth of our rejection. Because if that's point two. If you notice, the passage isn't exactly relaxed. Like it's a pretty firm, one of the firmer passages in the Bible, one of the stronger, phrased things in the Bible, which is interesting given the fact that there's no evidence that the people James is writing to were explicitly rejecting God and choosing to follow something else, or as he puts it, sort of the world. There's no evidence that they were saying, yeah, I think I'm done with God, I'd like to follow the world now. No, what James is after, and you see it through the whole book, is how they still say they believe all the things and still, go to church and do all the things. But they tend, at the same time, to imitate the world by being partial to people and discriminatory, by being self-exalting, by speaking negatively of others, by, showing bitter envy and selfish ambition and letting those things kind of drive their life and their interactions with others and their view of themselves and their view of the world. And so what James is trying to do here is to show us the depth of our rejection of God, not in our, conscious activities, but in the way we live our lives. And he's trying to raise the stakes such that we can see what's really happening when you let the values, the attitudes, the goals of the world begin to dictate the way you live, no matter how often you come to church. And that's why he says, you adulterous people. He's trying to get at this idea that if the depth of love, of God's love, is this kind of love, this marital, spousal kind of love that demands this kind of fidelity, then for you to then take on a friendship with the world is a kind of spiritual infidelity. And so all the things James is talking about are not just missteps. Oh, I happen to be a little partial, or I happen to, speak negatively, or I shouldn't have done that. They're adulterous relationships. He's trying to shake you awake a little bit, because we tend to think of sin that way. We tend to think of sin at some level. If you're a Christian, you have this category for sins you really shouldn't do. These big, you just shouldn't do these. And then you have this much larger category for things that you probably shouldn't do. But you're working on. There's a sense of I know I shouldn't do these, and if I did that, that would be a big deal. But if I do these, of course it's a big deal. I'm not trying to, sell my soul here. But I'm not going to worry that much about it, try and grow in it. God can't expect me to do all the things. There's this big stuff, and then there's just sort of the other stuff. And a lot of the things James talks about fits in the other stuff category. The respectable sins, the ones that, we all kind of do, and it's whatever. There's that attitude that we have, no one's perfect, we're just being human, that kind of thing. And yet set against the depth of God's love, the kind of relationship God desires for us, you find how off that is. When you have a cheating spouse, and they come, you got them there for counseling, and the cheating spouse comes in and says, look, nobody's perfect. I said I was sorry. Can't we just move on? One of the things you have to do as a marriage counselor is you have to look at them when they say something like that, and you have to, verbally, not physically, you have to shake them awake. That's not what's going on. You clearly don't understand the size, scope, and significance of what you've done, and the ramifications of it, and you don't understand. And it's understandable. People are complicated. Sometimes we don't understand, but we need to be shaken awake, and that's what James is saying here. It's true of you right now, James says, that you probably do not grasp how deep and wrong and severe it is when you let some of these values and attitudes and goals from the world dictate the way you live your life. You probably don't get it. You probably look at it and say, nobody's perfect. It's not great, but, come on. And he's trying to shake us awake. Now, understand, by world, James does not mean the physical world versus the spiritual and material world. He's talking about the idea that, as sort of an aggregation of humans, the world that we're in has created a set of attitudes and values and goals that exist out of rejection of this kind of love that God has for us. A love that demands that kind of primacy, where you're no, that's too much. And so we've sort of built this way, both individually and as a group, to sort of push that back and say, what I want to do is I want to, be in charge in that sense. And that's why, when you talk about things being worldly or being of the world, there's this old school version of that. I remember I was in a Christian fraternity at UCLA. It's not an oxymoron, it's a real thing. And I was there. But they had these old files from like the 40s and 50s, and these weird, file folders. And we were pulling a bunch of them out and looking through, and all these old pictures and stuff. And then out came this postcard sort of thing that had like these notes on it from, I don't know, a devotional they had or something like that. And the title of it was worldliness. Don't drink or chew or go with girls who do. And I was like, huh, like, okay. I mean, not to throw them under the bus. They probably knew it was deeper than that. But I was like, that feels superficial. Like, and when you come to James like this and you read the Bible, you realize that, well, okay, fair enough. There's plenty of sort of big, bold sins that are cast in relief because of how external they can be. And we can, find them and name them off. Worldliness is about an adoption of the kind of value system, the kind of attitudes that are built by the world that exists in rejection of God. Such that, the idea that I have the right to choose what I build my life on and how I will build it is peak worldliness. Like, that's a much better description than the rhyme. And so in that sense, worldliness is, because of that, it's a rejection of the marriage vows, it's a rejection of the relationship God wants, it's a relegation of God, from husband to like servant or assistant. And it's very stark, James says. When you see it this way, you realize you cannot have both. You can't both be faithful to the kind of love God has for you and step out with these attitudes and values and goals. To be a friend of the world, it also helps to understand that when James says friend, we tend to use the word friend like, a positive acquaintance, someone we like to hang out with, friendly. When James uses the word friend, it's from this older context where what they meant was like someone who saw the world the same way as you. So friends were people who were joined together in where they were going and why they were going there. Friends journeyed together. And that means then, if you're a friend of the world, you have to be an enemy of God, James says. To be a friendship with the world is enmity with God, because you can either journey with God where he's going or journey with the world where those values are going. But you clearly can't do both because they're literally going in two different directions. The goals are vastly different, even if they don't seem that different on the surface. And so, what James is getting at is this. In order to be a friend of the world, what you have to essentially do is to sneak out and do something that runs counter to your marriage and your marriage vows, and then sneak back into a relationship with God as if nothing's wrong. That's how this has to go. To be partial, to speak harshly, to let your selfish ambition drive, that's what has to be happening. And what James is getting at then with that is what might help, I guess, is the way to put it. What might help is understanding more of how these values and attitudes and goals work. If it's this serious, then we really ought to know what we're talking about. And what James does is he relies heavily, and he is in the whole book, on the Sermon on the Mount, and especially on the Beatitudes. This is part of what Jesus teaches that has these really interesting kind of phrases like, blessed are the meek, they'll inherit the earth. And then there's other parts of the Bible where Jesus says similar things that James brings in. In the Beatitudes, Jesus says, blessed are the poor. Blessed are you when you're persecuted and excluded. Blessed are you when you thirst for righteousness and hunger for righteousness. And then there's other places in the Bible where he says other things like, if you lose your life, you got to lose your life to save it. The greatest of you will be a servant to all. The last shall be first. And what we tend to do with it, James is relying heavily on this for the whole book. And these are the opposite of the values, the attitudes, the goals of the world. And what we tend to do is we all tend to have this folder inside somewhere that we label crazy things Jesus says. And so we have this, and we put in, blessed are the poor and blessed are the meek, and, the last shall be first. And we put them in there. And we put them in there because we need to have a place to store them so we don't have to actually do them. We need to have this sort of this arena. This is where the crazy stuff goes. And every once in a while, we trot them out to sort of feel a little better about the fact that the folder exists. So we'll come out and we'll say, I just really, I let everyone else go first in the food line. Just be a servant of all. I'm gonna get my buddy an extra nice Christmas gift. Maybe it's a little extra $10. Just really try to sacrifice and sell my things for him. He's poor. Whatever. Like there's this way that we tend to sort of trot them out in these superficial ways, and then when it comes to the actual decision making, the actual way we live our life, the actual attitudes and values and goals we have at work and at home and in our relationships and our family, the file is closed. And we operate on what I think James would call worldly values, on friendship with the world. Because at some level, why do you have that file? Why does that exist in the first place? Because we think the world's ideas are kind of better for us on this stuff. Like the idea of not just being a servant of all sometimes, but actually going into a room and looking around and going, how do I serve all these people? And not like for the first bit so I can get the serving out of the way and then I can go back to my stuff, but like for the rest of my life. That's what I do. I just serve other people and don't care about like myself that as much as I normally do. Like for like decades and decades and then I die. Like that's what Jesus said. But that just doesn't make sense. Like the world says something really different than that, and I have no concept of how I can live a happy life and do that. So I got to have a file for the crazy stuff. And so put the file away. And what James is doing in calling out these specific topics he brings out, caring for the needy when it's hard, actually being impartial, which sounds easy, but is extraordinarily difficult when it comes to doling out love and sacrifice and time and energy. Like not being driven by selfish ambition. Like when he's bringing out all the Beatitudes and saying, these are the values of your husband. This is what your marriage, culture is supposed to be like. Are you living that way? Or is the majority of your life actually focused on worldly values, worldly concerns, with this veneer of Christianity you've painted on top of it? He says, when that happens, that's not just you not being perfect because nobody's perfect. It's spiritual infidelity. Like there is a depth of love God has for you that you're violating when you do that. He says, you've got to get shaken awake to this stuff. It's not no big deal. This is a real thing, he says, because this is your primary relationship. In other words, look, like if this depth of God's love is true, and you should want it to be true, like you should want this, if it's true, and you should want it to be true because, some people, every week there's people here, and we're so glad you're here, who are kind of like, I guess I'm coming to church now. They show up and it's like, okay, this is, we're singing songs together, it feels like camp a little bit, I guess that's cool. Like there's a way to, and you come in, and I know, because, I talk to you guys, and I can relate. There's a sense where you go, gosh, like, I don't know if any of this is true. I don't know if I believe any of this. And what's fascinating to me about Christianity and all these things we're talking about now is like, okay, you should want it to be true though, right? Like you should want there to be a God who exists, who is your maker, who is so singularly committed to you that he wants to be called your husband, such that interacting with him will produce a kind of life where everywhere you go and everything you touch, you add gentleness and harmony when it wasn't there. And the way you speak to people is building up and not tearing down. And you're a peacemaker and not a divider. And you're someone who is able to endure suffering without entirely coming apart and yet still feel sad and not fake it. Like shouldn't you want that to be true? And it's funny to me because when I talk to people a lot of the time, the reason isn't that you don't think it's rational, it's that you don't want it to be true. And that gets us out of the realm of rationality and into another area altogether of what you desire out of your life and control and things like that. If you want it to be true, and you should want it to be true, then you have to understand how serious it is to reject that kind of love. Like how real it is, and not token and not make-believe, to look at God and say, thanks, but no thanks, at least not for the next couple of hours. And then to step back in like it's nothing. Like you have to, James is pushing on us, you have to see the depth of that rejection. It's not nothing. It's enmity with God. It's spiritual infidelity. That's the depth of our rejection. And so, you see the need for point 3. How does grace change us? And he says in verse 6, there's 2 ways grace changes us. It's 2 things. They cycle into each other, but there's 2. He says, but he gives more grace. One of the fascinating things about the Bible is as far as I know, there's no passage in it. I've read the whole thing. No passage in it that ever looks at you and says, look, what you got to do is just tweak a few things and you'll be fine. You never get that. And sometimes you want it, don't you? Like, just give me some steps or something. I feel like I would like to know how to get there. And if you could give me like a 5-step plan, that would be so great. And it never does. And the bar is raised so high all the time. Like, it's never like, I don't know, try and be nicer. It's like, die to self every day. Like, there's just no quarter given for like these halfway steps. And that's the whole Bible and James right here. And it stands in such distinction to every other option that's pitched your way. Like every other religion and philosophy and idea and lifestyle and sort of way of living is all about that idea of like streamline, produce, like adjust and conquer, and here are tips how to do it, and here's, you got to do more of this or less of this, you got to be more calm with this or fight for this, be more mindful of this, and then there's all these things you have to do to like get where you need to go, and that's all they are, is just tips. They're advice on how to get somewhere. Only Christianity says, look, the bar is so high, and you kind of know the bar is high internally no matter what you say you think. The bar is so high, you just can't do it. And there's no way that adjustments are going to get you any kind of true or real life. It's just not going to happen. You have to look to God, Christianity says, and he'll give you what you can't give yourself. In other words, everything else steps in at this point in the message and says, you know how to fix this? You have to give more. And only Christianity comes in and says, God gives more. He gives more grace. Only Christianity says God will exalt you. He'll lift you up. Everything else says you have to exalt yourself. You have to lift yourself up. No, only Christianity says you draw near to God and he'll draw near to you. It's a fascinating thing. And what's crazy to me is that all those other ideas, all those other philosophies, all those other ways of being and living, they're all tied to that value system of the world we just finished talking about. So all of that stuff, all the solutions are driven by the idea that you have to raise yourself up and you have to do all this stuff and you have to produce and you have to like make sure that you're not poor in spirit. Here's how you can get rich in spirit, and you're not mourning. Here's how you can be joyful and all these things. You have to fix all this stuff. In other words, the world is a really bad friend. Being friends with the world is awful because all it does is give you a bunch of stuff you can't do and then gives you more. That's essentially a toxic relationship. But we go back. And here James is saying that's not what God is like. This is the nature of God. Like, what do you think God is like? Like, the depth of love is deepened beyond what you could hope. It's not just a husband who has this amazing love and then is spurned and then just walks away. It's a husband who has this deep love and is spurned and then says, but he gives more grace. He comes back for the unfaithful. I've thought about writing a song. Oh, come all ye faithless. I'm totally serious. It'd be really fun to sing. Joyless and despondent. There's something to it. I mean, at some level, we should come as the faithful, but boy, shouldn't... Every other song says, come when you're faithful. Only Christianity says, come when you're faithless. There's something fascinating about this. This is what God is like. Or, one of my favorite songwriters, Andrew Peterson, has this line. It's from like 20 years ago, but I'll never forget it. It's in the second verse of one of his songs. And he talks about this fear he has. The fear that I'll fall one too many times. The fear that your love is no better than mine. And that's what we think. We think God gives the amount of grace we would give. No, God gives more grace. That's what he's like. That's his nature. That's that your maker is your husband. This is who you're married to. And that's the first way grace changes you, is when you understand that that's what God is like, that that's the response he has. In other words, he quotes Proverbs 3 in the end of verse 6. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. What that means is if you're proud, if you want to try and do this yourself, you're going to kind of stay away. The minute you show up, I mean, like the second you're like, I don't know if I should be doing this, maybe at that moment you're met with grace. At that moment, you're met with the grace and the love of God, a depth of love unlike you've ever seen. This is the grace of God. This is what you see in the cross of Jesus Christ, where he's crucified for our sins when he never deserved it. This is the grace of, he gives more grace. And that's the first way grace changes you, is when you see that, it creates a kind of trust in God's love that you didn't have before. When you see him as he is, as someone who's not stingy, a God who gives more grace even when he sees the depth of your sin. And that's the scary part, is when James shakes you and you actually wake up, like you're actually convicted, that's when you start to wonder. You go through life and you go, yeah, grace is amazing. You sing songs like, nice grace. Grace is nice. Grace is wonderful. Grace is great. You don't sing amazing grace until you're woken up and you actually wonder if he's going to bail. But when you're shaken awake to the infidelity at the core of you and you see him say, but he gives more grace, that's where it's at. That's what God is like. When you see that, it creates a trust in his love you didn't have before. And not just that first time. Remember, he's writing to Christians. This is an over and over again sort of thing. You're consistently having this experience. And yet then, grace does that, and then what it does is it continues to create this response, a new set of choices and actions that James talks about. Because unless the grace of God warms you that way, kind of melts you and disposes you then to kind of be able to say, I can be humble with you because you're not going to kick me out. Until you know you're going to be met with prodigal son kind of love. The minute you get seen coming home, he's running out to get you. Until you actually think that way, you're never going to be able to do this. You're never going to be able to follow through on what James is saying. You'll never draw near to God unless you realize he's the kind of God who gives you more grace, until you see his safety. And love always does this. See, James has this setup where he's going to talk to you about all the actions he's going to do. That's how love works. Like the safety of unconditional love always creates activity. Like safety always produces activity, always. Think of kids in like a loving home. Like they don't just sit around scared doing nothing. Kids in a loving home are almost always like the most boisterous, the ones who are going out and exploring friendships and exploring different things and out in the world and like doing different stuff, because the safety creates a space in which they can explore things they never would have if they were scared. Or, change the analogy, mountain climbing, which I have never done and never will do because it involves camping, I think. I don't know. I'm not, if I don't have to come close to death, I probably won't. Mountain climbing, if you're a mountain climber, like here's how it works. You get this like, if you're big time, you get this like the hammer drill, and you like bolt this anchor into the side of a rock, and then you tie a rope through it, and you harness, the safety harness. And the reason you go through all this trouble to get the safety harness on is because only when you're safe will you attempt things you never would have attempted if you weren't safe. It's the only reason you do it. This is why you don't, as a mountain climber, roll over to Starbucks with your hammer drill and bolt an anchor into the wall behind your seat and tie it up to your harness before you have a latte. Because it's not what safety's for. Safety's not for passivity, it's for activity. Safety always produces activity, always. And that's what, same here, the safety of grace creates space for the kind of activity you are built to do. Like the kind of relationship with God that you would never have attempted without that kind of grace. That's what it's meant to produce. Grace is meant to produce that kind of activity, things you never would have thought to try if you weren't that safe. And so James says, what does that look like? He says, submit yourself to God. In other words, submit sounds passive. It sounds like, well, let's see what God does. The idea here is one of a very active kind of allegiance, a redirecting of allegiance, such that across the board, it's almost got a military vibe to it. Like you are submitting to his orders, you're submitting to that relationship as you head out into the world. Like he is yours, he's the one in that sense. And then he goes into more detail in this sort of slew of commands that finish out the rest of the passage. And what you see in this detail is that these are going to, submitting to God this way is going to involve a daily relocation, a daily reframing, and a daily recommitting. And you see him in the way you go. So first, he says, resist the devil, he'll flee from you. Draw near to God, and he'll draw near to you. This is a daily kind of relocation. In other words, normally what happens is temptation comes to your door. The devil comes to your door in that sense. And he says, go with me. And you're very used to going. Again, not in terms of necessarily the big sins, though if that's true, you should stop it. But that's not the point. The point is in that sense in which my life is driven by a set of values and concerns that don't match up to the Beatitudes at all. That's my normal pattern. What's in it for me, what's fair to me, how I'd like to go, where I'd like to be, and I go to church, but that's my driving focus. And in other words, you're used to traveling with the devil. He knocks on the door and you say, yeah, let's go. Like yesterday and the day before. Instead, he says, you stand firm, you resist the devil, and he's going to leave. And then you relocate yourself. Instead of traveling that way, you relocate yourself by traveling towards God. You draw near to God, and he draws near to you. You choose that relationship over this one. Which, by the way, is a fascinating amount of power to have. However you conceive of spiritual warfare, the idea that, the devil is like a big deal. And the idea that you could have the devil knock on your door, and you have the kind of power to say, if I just don't go, he's going to leave. That's a fascinating amount of power you have at your disposal. There is no temptation where you're going to look at it and go like, I guess I had to go. I don't know, it seemed really strong. I mean, he might come back real quick. But James is saying the power you have at your disposal is such that you can look at the devil and say, no, when he leaves, he has to go. What a fascinating amount of power you have at your disposal. And then to turn and draw near to God and have him draw near to you, to have that relocating of relationship. I used to go this way, now I go this way. There's got to be a daily relocation. Every day temptation comes, you relocate. You relocate. But then there's a reframing, a daily reframing. He says, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Just be sad. That's not what he's saying. What he's after here, that first part, is cleansing your hands and purifying your hearts. Do you see cleansing, purifying, hands, hearts? There's a total sort of reframing of your priorities. Your priorities are reframed to say that my life today is about cleansing and purity. It's about holiness. It's about fidelity to God. In other words, we say stuff, God is, there's a thing, number one is God, number two is family or whatever, number three is work. We have these lists that we make of these priorities. And yet, at some level, when you wake up and go through your day and you stack up the totality of your thoughts, what are you actually thinking about accomplishing that day? Like, what's your actual priority scheme? It's almost always your to-do list, it's your career, it's something going on in your relationships, whatever it is, it's not God. And God is involved in those things, but that's not what you're doing. You're not like looking at those things like, oh, this is such a great subset of my relationship with God. No, you're just thinking about that stuff. In other words, your actual set of priorities has nothing to do with the primary relationship in your life. And the depth of God's love demands a kind of primary focus. And so he says, you got to reframe. And it's not going to just happen. You have to reframe your priority set to understand, this is my primary relationship. So today, in all those things I'm caring about and thinking about and doing, I have to have, with a sense of primacy, a sense of ultimate priority, that I have to love God through this. He has to be the priority in these things. Somehow, his relationship to these things and to me has to be my primary thing today. And therefore, holiness, cleansing, purity, inside and out, emotions and actions and all these things, you have to reframe for that. And then the same with that next part, be wretched and mourn and weep, your laughter turn into mourning. There's two kinds of laughter. One kind of laughter is just kind of a flippant, almost cynical, a kind of, the laughter that springs from denial. I just want to have some fun because things aren't great or because I'm not fulfilled. And so we just kind of joke around, like joking around that way. There's another kind of laughter that's really deep, that's kind of earthy and anchored to what it means to be human and how sometimes sideways human life is and surprising and frankly kind of beautiful. That's the difference between, people who are funny because they're really cynical and mean and people who are funny because they see things that you might not have seen but they showed it to you when you laughed together. James is talking about the first kind of laughter here. He says, look, if you step out with the world and come back to God and then you laugh about it, like you just don't think anything's wrong. He says, it's not loving to leave you there. You have to start caring. This is him shaking you up again. You have to see what's going on. You have to mourn and do some weeping, not because you should never be happy, but because you shouldn't be happy that way. And in that sense, he's reframing your priorities. Where do you find your joy? Where do you find your happiness? What do you look? He's reframing such that this relationship is the primary relationship, the central thing in your life, such that your emotions, your reactions, your activities, your goals, your value, they all derive back to this. So grace produces a daily kind of relocation, a daily kind of reframing of what your life's about and what the primary thing in your life is. And then last, a recommitment. That's that last verse 10. Humble yourselves before the Lord and he'll exalt you. It's like a vow renewal every morning. There's a kind of recommitting in this because what James is getting at here, in a sense he's summing up the entire passage, is the upside down way that this stuff plays out in our world. Humble yourself and you'll be exalted. Everything around you says exalt yourself apart from God and it'll work out better for you. And that's what drives all the other stuff. And then here James says, no, the only way up is down. Recommit. This one, humble yourself. I think it's fascinating. He doesn't say be humbled by God. He says humble yourself. There's an activity to this where you are recommitting. It's not just God's vows, it's yours, but you're looking at him saying, yes, this is what I want. I want to show up to you and not other stuff. And I'm going to humble myself here before you and I'm going to trust you to exalt me when the time's right. And that's where the fear is. That's what I hear at least when I talk to people, especially younger people today. Like, I don't want to get married. I think I understand. But they say things like that because there's questions about, like, how do I know this one person, will actually be good for me, like, long term? Like, how do I know that I'm not cutting off, like, other good options? Like, I don't know. So why would I do that? There's a fear in that. And I think in a much deeper and more visceral way, once you uncover all the layers, there's a fear here. When he says, humble yourself and I will exalt you, there's a piece of you that says, that's such a big ask. Because what if I I really do all the stuff in the file that I marked with crazy. Like, I actually do that stuff, and I live that way, and I do reframe, and I do this stuff, and then life ends up being one humiliation after another, and then I die. Like, what if? What if it's one demotion after another? What if it's just people laughing at me and being excluded? What if I have no purchase over how things go in my life? That feels like too much. And there's a way that you just instinctively cling. And James says, no, what you have to do is you have to recommit. When you ask the question, will God alone make me happy? Or do I need to exalt myself? He does what he always does, very indirectly, James. It's why, anyone who knew Jesus reads the book of James and immediately sees all of the things Jesus said in it. James is always pointing in the way he speaks. He's always pointing to his brother, Jesus the King. And he says, you see, it's not your recommitment that's going to fix this. He says, when you're scared and you don't want to, when you cling and white knuckle all these different things in your life and you realize it's sucking the life out of you, but you don't know what to do because you're scared to do anything else, you have to look at Jesus the King. You have to look at Jesus on the cross. You have to look at the depth of God's love for you, not just in the abstract, but in the concrete. In someone who actually lived this way and actually died, like, with nothing. The worst possible fate happened to him in every actual respect. That was his life. The Word made flesh. And when you look at him, this is my experience, the Bible testifies to this, I know a lot of you, this is your experience. When you look at him that way, you're able to say, I'll humble myself, how could I not trust you? It can't be crazy if you're the one asking me to do it. And in that, you find the strength to recommit and to say, okay, today and tonight and tomorrow, I will submit myself to God. This is my primary relationship. And all of a sudden, you find all the other things in James spilling out. The impartiality, the non-discrimination, the gentleness, the peace, the harmony, that sense of being someone with deep roots that provides lots of shade for other people. You find it coming because why don't those things happen? Because we step out with the world. It's when you submit to God, because you see his grace, you become that. Slowly, slowly, roots deeper, branches higher. And you find that deep satisfaction in your Lord and your Savior, the God who gives more grace and always will. Okay, let's pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.